In the Arizona Territory, a good deed was a good way to get yourself killed. For a widow named Martha Calloway, it was about to do a whole lot worse. The dust was a living thing in her valley. It choked the sky, scoured the paint from her little ranch house, and tasted like grit and sorrow. It had been a year since that same dust, mixed with gunpowder, had taken her husband Jebediah. He was the town lawman, and a botched bank robbery had left a silence in her life, louder than any gunshot. Martha was tough, forged by the frontier, but grief was a slow fire, burning her down from the inside. She ran the ranch by herself, a few cattle, a patch of corn, just enough to survive. But it wasn't enough to stop the whispers in town. Whispers that she should sell her land to Silas Corrigan and find a new man to take care of her. Silas Corrigan. The name was a poison in the air. He was a cattle baron who collected land like a buzzard collects bones, using a lawyer's pen or a hired gun's bullet. He was squeezing her town, Redemption Creek, strangling it by diverting the river for his massive herds. Jebediah had been looking into Corrigan's methods right before he died. The official story was crossfire with a gang of outlaws. But Martha knew better. She could feel Corrigan's shadow still lingering over her husband's grave. One Tuesday, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. A dust storm, a real haboob, was rolling in. A roaring, blinding wall of earth that was about to swallow the sun whole. Martha scrambled to get the animals into the barn, her heart pounding against her ribs. She slammed the big barn door shut just as the world went black. The wind howled like a demon, throwing rocks against the wood like buckshot. She waited inside, the air thick with the taste of clay, her hand resting on the smooth, worn stock of Jebediah's old Winchester. Hours passed. The roar finally faded to a low moan. Peeking through a crack in the door, she saw a world remade, a landscape of desolate brown. And that's when she saw them. Two figures, like ghosts walking out of the haze. A tall, gaunt man was half carrying a small boy. They stumbled toward her house, the man's legs giving out with every step. Her first instinct, the one Jebediah had drilled into her, was to raise the rifle. This was no place for soft hearts. But then the man collapsed, falling to his knees just yards from her porch, his body instinctively curling around the boy to shield him. Something inside Martha broke. It was the desperation in his posture, a father's last stand against the elements. She unbolted the door and ran out, the dust crunching under her boots. "Water!" the man rasped, his voice a raw crackle. He couldn't even lift his head. "Please, for my boy." Martha knelt, all her reservations washed away. The boy's face was a pale mask under the grime, his lips blue and cracked. She didn't hesitate for a second. "Bring him inside. Hurry." Together they got the unconscious child into the house, laying him on a small cot. The man swayed on his feet, all his strength gone. "You need water too," she said, her voice firm. He just shook his head, pointing a trembling finger at the boy. "Him first." Martha worked fast, bathing the boy's face with a cool cloth, dribbling water onto his lips. After a few agonizing moments, the boy stirred, his eyelids fluttering. The man let out a sigh of relief, so deep it seemed to suck the very last of his energy out of him. He collapsed into a chair, his head falling into his hands. "What's your name?" Martha asked, her voice softening as she watched the child breathe. "Cole," the man said. "The boy is Kit." His answers were short, clipped. His eyes, when he finally met hers, were startling. They were dark as night, intense, and seemed to look right through her. They held a pain and a watchfulness that made a shiver run down her spine. He was lean but with a wiry strength, his long, dark hair tied back with a leather strip. "You can stay in the barn," she offered, trying to keep a safe distance, "until the boy is strong enough to travel." Cole just nodded, his eyes already back on his son. "Thank you, ma'am. We're in your debt." That night Martha couldn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap, listening to the quiet breathing of the boy. She had let two strangers into her life. Her head screamed that it was a fool's risk, but her heart, so long empty, felt a tiny flicker of warmth. She didn't know that her act of kindness wasn't a risk. It was a reckoning. She had just dealt the first card in a deadly game for the soul of Redemption Creek, and she'd invited the most dangerous player in the territory to sit right at her table. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Kit, the boy, recovered with the startling resilience of youth. He was a solemn child who almost never spoke, but his large dark eyes missed nothing. He followed Martha around the ranch like a little shadow, watching her with an unnerving intensity as she did her chores. He'd spend hours on the porch whittling scraps of wood with a small, sharp knife his father had given him. He carved intricate figures, a hawk with its wings spread, a coiled rattlesnake, with a skill that was far beyond his years. Cole kept his word and moved their few belongings to the barn, but he didn't rest. From the moment the sun came up until it bled out behind the mountains, he worked. He never asked what needed doing, he just saw it and did it. The sagging fence line was now tight enough to hum in the wind. The leaky roof on the chicken coop was patched perfectly. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was mesmerizing. There was never a wasted motion. Martha watched him from her kitchen window, a knot of confusion tightening in her gut. Drifters were lazy, or loud, or dangerous. Cole was none of those things. He was quiet, reserved, and worked with the intense focus of a master craftsman. He and Kit spoke to each other in a language she'd never heard before, a series of soft clicks and flowing, guttural sounds. It sounded more like the whisper of wind through a canyon than human speech. Whenever they noticed her listening, they would fall instantly silent, their faces becoming unreadable stone. One evening, she brought a bowl of stew out to the barn. She found Cole sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife on a whetstone. The blade seemed to be an extension of his own hand. "You handle a knife like you were born with it," she said, setting the bowl down. He didn't look up. His hand just kept moving in smooth practice circles. "A man needs skills to survive out here. My Jebediah used to say a man's character is in the tools he keeps," Martha replied, trying to bridge the silence. "He kept his pistol clean and his Bible on the nightstand." Cole finally looked up, and his dark eyes seemed to pierce the twilight gloom. "Some men's prayers are answered with lead," he said, his voice low and flat, "and others with stone. The God you pray to matters, ma'am." The words hung in the air between them. It wasn't a threat, not really. It was a statement of fact from a world she couldn't possibly imagine. A world where prayers were answered with violence. And she was starting to realize he wasn't just passing through that world. He was a product of it. Their strange, uneasy peace was about to be shattered. The following week, two riders appeared on the horizon, their shapes wavering in the blistering Arizona heat. Martha's blood ran cold. She recognized them instantly. Wade and Travis, two of Silas Corrigan's most vicious thugs. Wade was a hulking brute who seemed to be permanently stained with tobacco juice, and Travis was a weasel of a man with cold, dead eyes. "Stay in the barn," Martha ordered Cole, her voice low and urgent. "Don't come out. This is my business." She met them on the porch, her stance rigid, the Winchester held loosely in her hands. "Mornin', Widow Calloway," Wade sneered, his eyes raking over her property with contempt. "Place is looking a little worn. Mr. Corrigan, he's worried about you." "I'm sure he is," Martha said, her voice dripping ice. "You can tell Mr. Corrigan I don't need his concern." "This ain't about concern," Travis chimed in, swinging off his horse. He swaggered over to her water trough and spat a long, brown stream of tobacco juice into the clean water. "It's about the new water tariff. Mr. Corrigan owns the rights to the river now. Your monthly payment is $20. $20. It might as well have been 20,000. A cold, sharp rage shot through Martha. "This ranch has had water rights for 50 years. My husband filed the claim himself." "Well, your husband ain't here no more, is he?" Wade said with a cruel, gap-toothed grin. "Things change." Travis took a step onto the porch, getting too close. "Now you can pay us in cash," he said, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Or we can make other arrangements." Before Martha could even think to raise the rifle, the barn door creaked open. Cole stepped out into the blinding sunlight. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence was so sudden, so utterly silent, that both of Corrigan's men flinched as if they'd been shot at. "The lady asked you to leave," Cole said. His voice was completely flat, without a trace of emotion, but it carried more menace than a cougar's growl. Wade let out a harsh, ugly laugh. Well, look what the cat dragged in. The widow got herself a pet farmhand. Who the hell are you, stranger? Cole didn't answer. He just stood there, his body perfectly still, but coiled with a tension that was terrifying to watch. His eyes were locked on Travis, who was still standing way too close to Martha on the porch. What's the matter, you deaf? Travis snarled, turning his attention to Cole. He made a fatal mistake. He reached for the pistol on his hip. It happened faster than a blink. Cole moved, not like a man, but like a blur. He took two fluid, silent steps forward. His left hand shot out and clamped onto Travis's wrist, twisting it at a sharp, unnatural angle. A sickening crack echoed across the yard. Travis shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, and his pistol clattered to the wooden porch. In the exact same motion, Cole's right hand had plucked the long knife from the sheath on his belt. He didn't slash or stab. He just reversed his grip and pressed the razor-sharp point against the soft underside of Wade's jaw, just hard enough to draw a single, bright red drop of blood. Wade froze, his eyes bugging out of his head with shock and raw fear. All the big man's bluster vanished, replaced by the primal terror of a creature that has just come face to face with a true predator. His gun, Cole said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. Drop it, slowly. Wade's gun belt thudded into the dust. Now, Cole continued, his eyes never leaving Wade's, you will put your friend on his horse. You will get on your horse, and you will ride back to your master and tell him this land is not his. Tell him if you or any of his other dogs ever set foot on it again, I will gut you both from belly to throat. Cole's voice was a low whisper, but every word was a promise. Do you understand me? Wade, trembling like a leaf, could only manage a choked, pathetic nod. He clumsily hauled the whimpering Travis onto his horse and scrambled onto his own. They galloped away as if the devil himself was on their heels, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and a heavy, ringing silence. Martha stood there stunned. The Winchester in her hands felt as useless as a child's toy. She'd seen fights before. She'd seen Jebediah face down dangerous men. But she had never, ever seen anything like this. It wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling. It was precise, brutal, and executed with a skill that felt ancient, inhuman. She turned to look at Cole. He was calmly wiping that single drop of blood from his knife on his trousers. He wasn't even breathing hard. His face was a mask of stone. Who are you? She breathed, the question filled with a new and profound kind of fear. Cole finally met her gaze. The mask cracked for just a fraction of a second, and in his eyes she saw a deep, weary sorrow that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. I'm just a man looking for work, ma'am, he said quietly. But they both knew it was a lie. A drifter didn't fight like that. A farmhand didn't move with that kind of lethal, predatory grace. She had given shelter to a man who was more dangerous than a whole gang of outlaws, and he had just declared war on Silas Corrigan. On her behalf, her quiet life of grief was over. The storm that brought Cole and his son to her door was nothing. Absolutely nothing compared to the storm that was about to break over all their heads. News travels fast in a small town, and the story of what happened at the Callaway Ranch spread like wildfire. Of course, Wade and Travis didn't tell the truth. They spun a wild tale about being ambushed by a whole gang of hired guns the widow had brought in. But the details they let slip in their drunken rambling were too strange, too specific. A man who could break your wrist with a simple twist. A man who could have a knife at your throat before you could even clear your holster. The stories painted a picture not of a gang, but of a single, terrifyingly efficient man. 2 days later, when Martha rode into Redemption Creek for supplies, the air was different. The sympathetic nods she usually got were gone, replaced by suspicious glances and hushed whispers that stopped the moment she got close. Mildred Peterman, the owner of the general store and the town's chief gossip, was polishing her counter with a furious energy that screamed disapproval. Martha, she said, her voice tight, people are talking. They're saying you've taken in a dangerous man, a hired gun. I've taken in a man who stood up to Corrigan's thugs, Martha shot back, her chin held high, which is more than anyone else in this town is willing to do, including Sheriff Bowden. She glanced across the dusty street at the sheriff's office. Dale Bowden was a good man, deep down, but he was old, tired, and scared to death of Silas Corrigan. He spent most of his days avoiding trouble, not looking for it. "It's not that simple, Martha," Mildred insisted, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Wade was down at the saloon, telling everyone. He said your man. He said he moves like an Indian, fights like one, too." The word just hung there in the still, hot air. Indian. In the Arizona Territory in 1885, it was more than a word. It was an accusation, a curse. The Apache Wars were a fresh, bloody scar on the memory of every settler. To most folks, the only good Apache was a dead one. A cold dread seeped into Martha's bones. She thought of Cole's high cheekbones, his long dark hair. She thought of the strange, guttural language he spoke with his son. It was a possibility she had pushed to the back of her mind, refusing to look at it. But hearing it spoken aloud in the general store, it felt like a cold, hard truth. "He's just a drifter," she said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. She quickly gathered her things, paid her bill, and walked out of the store under the weight of a dozen pairs of accusing eyes. Her worst fears were confirmed on the ride home. She took a longer route, one that led past the old mission ruins, and that's when she saw him. It was Cole, a half-mile away, perched on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire valley. He wasn't just resting. He was perfectly still, like he was part of the rock itself, his focus absolute. He wasn't looking for work. He was watching Corrigan's sprawling ranch headquarters in the distance. He wasn't a farmhand. He was a scout, a warrior. He moved and thought like a man who was born of this harsh, sun-baked land. He was Apache. The realization hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't hatred she felt, but a deep, terrifying understanding. The man protecting her was from the very people her own kind had fought, killed, and driven from this land for generations. The chasm between their worlds suddenly seemed impossibly wide, a canyon she could never hope to cross. Meanwhile, in his fancy ranch house, Silas Corrigan was getting a much more detailed report. His foreman, a ruthless ex-comanchero named Royce with a face like a roadmap of bad decisions, had been doing some asking around. "The man at the Callaway place," Royce said, his scarred face impassive. "He's no drifter. My contacts on the San Carlos reservation say a Chiricahua warrior left the agency about a month back. A man they call Taza. The name means strong. Fits the description. Took his boy with him. They say he can walk in the white man's world as easily as he walks in his own." Corrigan, a portly man with the cold, dead eyes of a shark, swirled the whiskey in his glass. "An Apache," he mused. "A lone brave playing knight in shining armor for a white widow. What in God's name for?" "I don't know," Royce admitted, "but it's no coincidence. He ain't there for her land, and he ain't there for her cattle. He's there for you, boss." Corrigan slammed the glass down on his heavy oak desk, the whiskey sloshing over the rim. "I've paid off the army. I've bribed the politicians. I will not be stopped by one renegade savage playing hero. He has made this personal." His face twisted into an ugly snarl. "I'm not just going to run the widow off her land anymore. I'm going to wipe that entire pathetic town off the map. Let's see her Apache protectors save them from that." Corrigan's revenge was insidious. He didn't ride into Redemption Creek with guns blazing. He was smarter than that. He used a weapon he had perfected over years of ruthless acquisition. Fear. He started by poisoning the well. Not the town well. That would be too obvious. He targeted a small tributary downstream from his own water diversion, a creek used by a handful of old prospectors. Within days, they fell violently ill. One of them, a kind old man named Peterson, who had been a good friend to Jebediah, died in screaming agony. Dr. Elias Finch, the town's quiet, logical physician, confirmed it was poison. But Sheriff Bowden, his hands tied by his own terror, refused to investigate. He just called it bad water and locked himself in his office. Next, Corrigan's men rode in the dead of night and burned the town's small church to the ground. They didn't hurt anyone, but the message was as clear as the flames licking the night sky. No place is sacred. No one is safe. And panic, true gut-twisting panic, began to take hold of Redemption Creek. The whispers about Martha and her Indian protector grew into a roar. It was so much easier to blame the stranger, the outsider, than to confront the terrifying power of Silas Corrigan. They convinced themselves that the Apache had brought a curse. The poisoned water, the church fire, it was bad medicine, they said. Apache vengeance for some unknown crime. The town was turning on itself, eating its own heart out with fear and suspicion. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning. Martha was in the barn mending a harness when she heard them coming. It wasn't just a few riders. It was half the men from town, led by a burly blacksmith named Gus. They weren't a lynch mob, not yet, but they were close. They carried rifles and shotguns and a righteous fury born of absolute terror. Sheriff Bowden was with them, his face pale and sweating, a man swept up in a tide he was too weak to fight. "Martha!" Gus bellowed, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "We know what he is. Send out the Apache. He brought this trouble on us. We're turning him over to Corrigan. Maybe then he'll leave us in peace." Kit, who had been playing with one of his carved wooden animals nearby, ran into the barn, his eyes wide with a fear that tore at Martha's soul. From the deep shadows of a stall, Cole appeared. His face was grim, a mask of cold fury. "Stay behind me," he said to Martha, his voice a low rumble. Then he stepped out of the barn to face the mob. He was unarmed. He was unflinching. "You're making a mistake," Cole said, his voice carrying clearly over the angry murmurs. "Corrigan is your enemy, not me." "Liar!" someone screamed from the back of the crowd. "You're a curse on this town." Gus raised his rifle, the barrel trembling slightly. "We're done talking. Give yourself up, or we'll burn this place down around you." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, men who had danced at her wedding, men who had mourned with her at Jebediah's funeral. Now their faces were twisted into masks of ignorant hatred. They were willing to sacrifice an innocent man, an innocent child, just to appease the monster who was actually destroying them. In that moment, something inside her hardened into steel. She stepped out of the barn and stood right beside Cole, raising her own Winchester rifle. Her voice when she spoke didn't tremble. It rang out across the yard like a clarion call. "If you want him," she declared, "you'll have to come through me." The standoff was a brittle, fragile thing, a single harsh word away from shattering into bloodshed. The armed townsmen shuffled their feet, their conviction wavering in the face of Martha's iron defiance. She was one of them. She was Jebediah's widow. To fire on her was unthinkable, but their fear of Corrigan was a potent, poisonous thing, clouding their judgment, turning them into something ugly. "Don't be a fool, Martha," Gus shouted, his face flushed with frustration. "He's a savage. He's probably the one who poisoned old man Peterson and burned down the church." "He has done nothing but protect me and mine," she retorted, her knuckles white on the rifle stock, "which is more than I can say for any of you." Sheriff Bowden finally stepped forward, his hands held up in a weak, placating gesture. "Now hold on, everyone. Let's all just calm down. There's no need for—" His words were cut short by the thunder of hooves. A dozen of Corrigan's regulators, led by the foreman Royce, crested the low ridge behind the townsmen. They'd been waiting there the whole time, watching, letting the town's fear do their dirty work for them. Now they were here to close the trap. The townsmen turned, their expressions shifting from righteous anger to sudden alarm. They had come as a posse of concerned citizens. Now they were caught between a woman they couldn't bring themselves to harm and a force of hired killers that would slaughter them without a second thought. Royce trotted his horse forward, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across his scarred face. "Well, well, Sheriff, looks like you've got a little insurrection on your hands. Mr. Corrigan is a man of law and order. He sent us to help you put it down." He gestured with his rifle toward Cole. "Starting with him." The moment stretched, thin and tight. Cole's eyes darted between Royce's men, calculating angles, threats, possibilities. He knew this was it, the tipping point. He glanced at Martha, her face pale but resolute. He saw Kit, his small son, peering from the shadows of the barn door. He had tried to be a ghost, a quiet protector. That time was over. Royce raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Cole's chest. "Last chance, Apache. Surrender now." What happened next was burned into the memory of every person in that yard for the rest of their lives. Cole moved. It wasn't human speed. It was the blur of a striking rattlesnake. In one single fluid motion, he lunged to his left, grabbing the barrel of the blacksmith's shotgun. He used Gus's larger body as a shield, twisting the weapon upwards just as Royce fired. The regulator's bullet whistled harmlessly over their heads. Before Gus could even react, Cole had disarmed him, shoving the big blacksmith into the men beside him, sending them sprawling. He spun, the captured shotgun now in his hands. But he didn't fire it. He used it as a club, a blur of wood and steel. He cracked one man across the jaw, used the butt to smash another's shooting hand, and swept the legs out from under a third. It took less than 5 seconds. 3 of the townsmen were on the ground groaning, their weapons scattered in the dust. The rest of the mob just stood there, frozen in stunned disbelief. Corrigan's men were equally shocked. They had expected a cornered animal, not a whirlwind of disciplined, disarming violence. Cole stood in the center of the yard, breathing easily, the shotgun held at the ready. He wasn't looking at the men he'd just taken down. His obsidian eyes were locked on Royce. "I am no one's curse," he said, and for the first time his voice held the cold, hard authority of a leader. "My name is Taza. I am of the Chiricahua Apache." He then turned his gaze to the stunned faces of the townsmen. "And I did not come here to harm this town. I came here to save it." Royce let out a ragged, ugly laugh. "Save it from what, Apache? From progress?" "From a snake who poisons the water his own people drink," Taza answered, his voice ringing with contempt. "Your Silas Corrigan doesn't build. He consumes. He will drive his cattle over your graves and call it progress. He is a sickness, a blight on the land, a blight my people and yours must cut out before it kills us all." His words, spoken with such raw conviction, struck a chord of truth that the town's fear had long suppressed. They knew Corrigan was evil. They had just been too damn scared to admit it, even to themselves. "Why?" Dr. Finch called out from the back of the crowd. The doctor was a man of science and reason, and he was looking at Taza not as a savage, but as a puzzle he needed to solve. "Why would your people care about what happens to Redemption Creek?" This was the moment of truth. Taza lowered the shotgun slightly, a small gesture of trust. "Because our shaman saw a vision," he said, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "He saw the water of this valley turning black. He saw the land cracking with a thirst that could not be quenched. He saw the bones of the buffalo piled as high as a man. He saw Corrigan's greed spreading like a plague, a shadow that would crawl from this valley all the way to the sacred mountains of my people." Taza looked from face to face, his eyes burning into theirs. "The vision showed that Redemption Creek is the first stone that starts the avalanche. If you fall, if Corrigan breaks you, his power will be absolute. He will take everything, not just from you, but from us. We have been enemies, your people and mine. But today we share a common foe, and he will show neither of us any mercy." A heavy, profound silence fell over the yard. The truth of his words was undeniable. Royce, seeing that he was losing control of the situation, sneered. "Don't listen to his heathen lies. They're just words. Kill him!" He spurred his horse forward, raising his pistol to fire point blank at Taza. But from the dark doorway of the barn, a small stone flew through the air. It was thrown with incredible speed and impossible accuracy by the small, silent boy, Kit. It struck Royce's gun hand, and his shot went wild, barking harmlessly at the sky. Royce howled in a mixture of pain and surprise. That split second was all the opening Martha needed. She fired the Winchester. She didn't aim at a man. She aimed at the ground right in front of Royce's rearing horse. The stallion screamed and bucked wildly, throwing the foreman from the saddle into the dusty yard. Seeing this, witnessing this sudden, shocking turn of events, Sheriff Bowden finally found his courage. A lifetime of fear was washed away by a single moment of clarity. He drew his own pistol and fired it into the air. "Enough!" he roared, his voice shaking but firm. "This is my town, Royce. You and your men are under arrest for incitement to riot and attempted murder." The regulators looked at their leader, whimpering on the ground. They looked at the townsmen, who were no longer a confused mob but were now staring at them with a dawning, murderous fury. The regulators were paid bullies, not soldiers. They weren't willing to die for Silas Corrigan's land grab. Outnumbered and with their leader down, they slowly, grudgingly, raised their hands in the air. The mob had vanished. In its place stood a group of chastened, ashamed citizens of Redemption Creek. They looked from the captured regulators to the Apache warrior, who now stood beside the widow who had shamed them all with her unwavering courage. Later that evening, after the regulators were locked away in the town's flimsy jail cells, a small group gathered in Martha's kitchen. It was Martha, Dr. Finch, Sheriff Bowden, and a deeply humbled Gus the blacksmith. Kit was asleep on his cot, his small hand still clutching the smooth gray stone he had used to save his father. Taza stood by the window, a silent silhouette looking out at the vast, dark desert. Everything he said, it makes a terrible kind of sense, Dr. Finch mused, stirring his coffee. He fought 10 men today, Gus said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and shame. And he never tried to kill a single one of them. Jebediah would have been proud to have a man like that at his back. Martha looked at Taza's silhouette. He was a warrior from a people she'd been taught to fear her whole life, a man of profound violence, and yet of profound principle. He had been sent to save them, but to do that, he had to risk being destroyed by them. "What do we do now, Taza?" she asked, the Apache name feeling natural on her tongue for the first time. He turned from the window and his face was grim in the lamplight. "We have wounded the serpent," he said. "Now it will come to kill us all. Corrigan will not send a handful of men next time. He will send an army." Taza's dark eyes met hers. "You wanted a fight," he said. "Now you have a war. We must prepare." The arrest of his foreman and a dozen of his men was an insult Silas Corrigan could not possibly abide. It was a declaration of open war, and he intended to answer it with overwhelming, annihilating force. He dispatched riders to Tucson and Tombstone, calling in every debt, every favor. He put out the word, silver for any hired gun, ex-convict, or desperate man willing to ride for him. Within 3 days, a small, brutal army of nearly 60 men, the worst dregs the territory had to offer, had gathered at his ranch. His orders were simple and cruel. Burn Redemption Creek to the ground. Kill every man who stands against you, and bring the Calloway woman to me. In Redemption Creek, the atmosphere had transformed. The fear-driven hatred was gone, replaced by a grim, teeth-clenched determination. Taza's words, followed by their own collective act of defiance, had forged a new and fragile unity. He was no longer the outsider, the curse. He was their strategist, their only real hope. He gathered the able-bodied men in the dusty street outside the sheriff's office. There were fewer than 20 of them in total. Gus the blacksmith, a few tough-as-nails prospectors, a young deputy named Miller who had idolized Jebediah, and a handful of ranchers and store owners who had finally found their spine. 60 men are coming, Taza began, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the nervous tension. They will ride hard and fast, expecting to roll over a town of cowards. We will not fight them where they are strong. We will not meet them in the open field. This town, these rocks, these buildings, these will be our weapons. For the next 2 days under Taza's command, Redemption Creek was transformed from a sleepy backwater into a deadly fortified trap. His understanding of terrain, of ambush, of guerrilla warfare was nothing short of masterful. He wasn't trying to turn them into soldiers. He was teaching them to be hunters, to use their environment as the Apache had for centuries to fight off armies 10 times their size. At the forge, Gus and his apprentices worked day and night, hammering out dozens of caltrops, sharp, four-pointed iron jacks designed to cripple the horses of a charging force. The prospectors, who knew their way around dynamite, were tasked with a more explosive project. They set charges in the narrow canyon pass a mile east of town, the only direct approach. The charges were wired to a single detonator, hidden in the rocks above, ready to be triggered at the perfect moment to create a rock slide, splitting Corrigan's force and throwing them into chaos. Taza had the men string rope and wire at neck height between buildings on the side streets, nearly invisible in the dust and shadows, a simple but deadly trap for any rider who broke from the main street. He positioned the town's best riflemen on the rooftops. Martha was one of them. Her grief had been burned away, replaced by a cold, protective fury. This was her ranch, her town. The boy, Kit, now looked at her with a trust that she would die to protect. She would not let Corrigan take any of it. She practiced with Jebediah's Winchester until cycling the lever and acquiring a target became a single, fluid thought. Taza himself seemed tireless, his energy drawn from some deep, internal well. He moved among the townsfolk, his instructions precise, his praise quiet but meaningful. He showed them how to build makeshift barricades from overturned wagons and barrels filled with earth. He taught them about firing lanes and crossfire, transforming their one dusty street into a kill box. The change in the town was palpable. Men who had been ready to lynch Taza just days before now hung on his every word. Their respect for his skill and his quiet dignity overrode generations of ingrained prejudice. Even Mildred Peterman, deeply shamed by her earlier fear-mongering, organized the other women. They stockpiled water, food, and bandages in the cellar of the general store, which Dr. Finch was preparing as a makeshift infirmary. During these frantic preparations, a quiet bond deepened between Taza and Martha. In the cool evenings after the long days of work, they would sit on her porch while Kit slept inside. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. "You miss him," Taza said one night, nodding toward the house where Jebediah's memory still lingered. It wasn't a question. "Every day," Martha admitted, her voice soft. "Jebediah was about order. He believed in the law, in fences and deeds. He believed you could tame this land." "My people do not believe the land can be tamed," Taza replied, his gaze lost in the vast, starlit desert. "We believe we are a part of it. The wind, the rock, the coyote, we are the same. Corrigan is the one who believes in taming. He builds fences not to keep his cattle in, but to keep the world out. That is why he must be stopped. His fence will eventually surround everything." "And you, Taza?" Martha asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What will you do when this is over?" A shadow passed over his features, a deep and ancient sadness. "I will take my son and return to my people, to the reservation. It is a cage, but it is where we survive. My duty was to honor the vision, to stop the plague from spreading from this valley. My hope," he added, his voice dropping so low she could barely hear it, "is to see my son grow into a man who knows the songs of his ancestors." Martha felt a sharp pang of sorrow. For a brief, foolish moment, she had allowed herself to imagine a different future. One where this strange, powerful man and his quiet, watchful son might stay. But she knew it was a dream. Their worlds were too different. He was a warrior on a sacred mission, and she was a widow tied to a small piece of land. But here, in this one desperate moment, their paths had converged. They were allies, partners forged in the fire of a common enemy. Kit was the living symbol of that bridge between them, a boy with an Apache soul who had found a mother's kindness in a white woman's home. On the morning of the third day, the lookout Taza had posted on the eastern ridge came galloping back, his face a mask of dust and panic. "They're coming!" he yelled. "A whole damn army of them!" A grim silence fell over the town. The time for preparation was over. Taza climbed to the roof of the general store, the highest point in town. He stood there for a long moment, a lone, dark figure against the vast, indifferent blue sky. He scanned the defenses, his eyes missing nothing. Then he looked down at the handful of determined faces looking up at him. Faces that had once been twisted with hate, now filled with a desperate, trusting hope. He raised a single hand. Then he let it drop. It was the signal. The battle for Redemption Creek was about to begin. The cloud of dust on the horizon was massive, a dirty brown stain growing larger by the second. Soon it resolved into the shapes of 60 riders, a wave of malice sweeping down on Redemption Creek. At their head was Silas Corrigan himself, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, his bulk squeezed into a fine leather coat. He rode not as a cattleman, but as a conquering general returning to crush a peasant rebellion. In the canyon pass, a grizzled old prospector named Finn waited, his hand trembling on the dynamite plunger. Taza's instructions had been brutally explicit. Wait for the main body of riders to pass the balanced rock. Not a second before, Finn watched as the first riders entered the narrow passage. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The fate of the entire town rested on his timing. Corrigan and about 40 of his men thundered past the balanced rock. Finn took a deep breath, whispered a prayer, and shoved the plunger down. The explosion was deafening. A huge section of the canyon wall sheared away, crashing down in a titanic cloud of rock and dust. The rock slide didn't just block the pass. It split Corrigan's force in two. The 20 men in the rear were completely cut off, their horses rearing in panic. The main force was thrown into chaos, trapped between the rock, slide behind them, and the unknown horrors of the town ahead. Now! Taza's voice cut through the ringing in their ears, a sharp command from the rooftop. As Corrigan's disorganized vanguard charged out of the canyon and onto the main road, their horses began to scream. They hit the scattered caltrops. The iron spikes punched through hooves, sending horses and riders tumbling into the dust in a horrific tangle of broken limbs and desperate curses. The glorious charge dissolved into a confused, bleeding mess. This was the signal for the riflemen. From the rooftops, Martha, Gus, and the others opened fire. Following Taz's instructions, they weren't aiming for kills, not yet. They were aiming for chaos. They targeted horses, shot hats off heads, and shattered the windows of the saloon right next to the riders. The effect was immediate. Panic multiplied. Corrigan, his face purple with rage, bellowed at his men to rally. "It's a trick! Push through! Get to the street! Kill them all!" A small group of the most hardened gunmen managed to break through the screen of wounded horses and charge down the main street. They ran straight into Taz's kill box. The ropes and wires, invisible in the dusty chaos, sang out. Riders were clotheslined from their saddles, their necks snapping or their bodies hitting the ground with bone-jarring force. At the same moment, gunfire erupted from windows and from behind the makeshift barricades on both sides of the street. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The confined space of the street became a death trap, but Corrigan's men were numerous, and they were desperate. They dismounted, using their dead and dying horses for cover, and began a systematic assault, advancing from building to building. The real fight began then, a brutal, close-quarter struggle for every inch of Redemption Creek. And Taza was everywhere at once. He was not on a rooftop, picking off targets from safety. He was on the ground, a phantom moving through the alleys and walkways he had memorized. He moved with his knife and a captured pistol, a whirlwind of deadly efficiency. He would appear behind a group of thugs trying to flank a position, disable them with a series of swift, brutal, non-lethal blows, and then vanish into the shadows before they even knew what had hit them. He was not just a warrior. He was an avenging spirit of the very land they sought to conquer. Martha, perched on the roof of what had been her husband's office, was a steady, calming force of death. Her shots were measured and true. She saw Deputy Miller pinned down behind a water trough, about to be overrun. With two quick, precise shots, she dropped the two gunmen advancing on him, giving the young man the chance to scramble to better cover. She wasn't just fighting for her home. She was protecting her husband's legacy, the very idea of a town governed by law and decency, not by fear and greed. The battle raged for over an hour. The town's defenders, outnumbered 3-1, fighting with the ferocity of people who have nothing left to lose. Gus the blacksmith wielded a heavy sledgehammer in one hand and a massive pistol in the other, a veritable giant holding the entrance to the smithy against all comers. Dr. Finch, armed with a tiny derringer, defended the cellar infirmary where Mildred Peterman was tending to the wounded, including a few of Corrigan's own men. Finally, the tide began to turn. Corrigan's forces were battered, their numbers dwindling, their morale shattered. They had expected an easy slaughter, not a meat grinder that chewed up men and spat out bodies. Silas Corrigan, his fine coat now stained with dust and another man's blood, watched his army disintegrate around him. In a fit of pure, frustrated rage, he spotted her. Martha, on the rooftop. He saw her as the source of all this defiance. He raised his own heavy buffalo rifle, taking careful, deliberate aim. He was going to kill the woman who had started it all. He never fired the shot. A shadow fell over him. Taza dropped from the awning of the saloon directly behind him. He landed as silently as a cat. Corrigan spun around, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The final confrontation was not a prolonged duel. Corrigan was a bully and a plotter, not a fighter. He tried to bring his huge rifle to bear, but Taza was too close, too fast. Taza's hand shot out, not with a knife, but with a heavy, smooth river stone he held in his palm, a primitive but brutally effective war club. He struck Corrigan's wrist, and the rifle clattered into the dust. He struck him again, a sharp blow to the shoulder that dislocated it with an audible pop. Corrigan roared in pain and stumbled back, his face a mask of agony. "This land does not belong to you," Taza said, his voice low and cold as a winter wind. "You are the poison, and the land always purges the poison." He didn't kill him. He simply dismantled him, broke him, and then stood back as Sheriff Bowden and Gus the blacksmith rushed forward to haul the whimpering, broken cattle baron to his feet. With their leader captured and their numbers decimated, the remaining regulators broke and fled, scattering into the desert like quail. A ragged, exhausted cheer went up from the defenders of Redemption Creek. They had done the impossible. They had stood their ground, and they had won. The aftermath was grim. The town was scarred, bullet-pocked, and blood-stained. They had lost 4 of their own, with many more wounded. But they were not broken. They had been forged anew in the fires of battle. A week later, Silas Corrigan was handed over to a U.S. Marshal destined for a federal prison in Yuma. His empire, built on fear and intimidation, crumbled without him to hold it together. One morning as the sun rose, painting the desert in hues of golden rose, Martha walked out onto her porch. Taza and Kit were there, with 2 horses packed and ready to travel. A quiet, inevitable sadness hung in the air. "It is time," Taza said simply. Martha knelt down in front of Kit. Her eyes welled with tears she couldn't stop. The silent boy, who had barely spoken a word of English the entire time, looked up at her and said, in a clear, soft voice, "Thank you, Martha." He pressed one of his whittled birds, a beautifully carved hawk, into her hand. She hugged him tightly, then stood to face his father. "Will you be safe?" she asked, her voice thick. "We are Apache," Taza said, and the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. "We endure." He swung himself onto his horse, then looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a universe of unspoken emotion. "You are a strong woman, Martha Calloway, as strong as the mountains. Your town is safe now." She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She watched as they rode east, not toward the setting sun of the white man's dream, but toward the rising sun of their own people. A father and son, 2 worlds that had briefly united, now heading home. Martha stood on her porch for a long time, the small wooden hawk clutched in her hand, and knew that her life was forever changed. She had given shelter to a drifter and his boy, and in return, they had given her back her town, her strength, and her hope. The dust still blew through the Sulphur Springs Valley, but for the first time in a long time, it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a promise. The story of Martha Calloway and the Apache warrior Taza isn't one you'll find in any official history books. It's a tale whispered on the desert wind, a testament to the fact that heroes are rarely the ones we expect. It reminds us that sometimes the deepest canyons between people, of culture, of race, of history, can be bridged by a simple act of compassion and the courage to stand together against a common evil. Their battle for Redemption Creek shows that true strength isn't found in a gun or a deed to a piece of land, but in the will of ordinary people, led by an extraordinary soul, fighting to protect their home. If this story of unlikely courage and hidden heroes resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a true tale of the Wild West. And be sure to subscribe for more stories that uncover the forgotten legends of our past. Thank you for listening.